The portal was supposed to take her to the Archive of Mists. That was where Seraphine Voss had been headed on that particular Tuesday evening, not that the archive cared much about days of the week, but she did. She was a creature of habit, a researcher by profession and by personality, and she had packed exactly what she needed for a routine retrieval: one leather satchel, 2 ink-sealed scrolls, a warded travel cloak, and a thermos of chamomile tea that had gone cold somewhere around the third enchantment she had cast to stabilize the portal ring. The Archive of Mists was a neutral library that existed between dimensions, maintained by a council of aging scholars who had long since decided that knowledge was more interesting than allegiance. Seraphine visited it roughly once a month, always through the same portal ring she kept bolted to the stone wall of her study, always with the same exit coordinates carved into the activation plate. It was routine, it was familiar, it was, by every reasonable standard, completely safe. So when she stepped through the shimmering blue light and felt the air on the other side hit her like a wall of heated iron, she knew immediately that something had gone wrong. She stood in darkness so complete it felt solid. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and aged stone, and something else she couldn't name at first, something almost sweet beneath the weight of everything else, like charred cedar or old candle wax. The ground under her boots was smooth volcanic rock, worn down by what must have been centuries of footsteps. Somewhere far above her, too high to see clearly, something glowed, not fire exactly, but a deep and sourceless red that painted everything in crimson shadow. Seraphine set down her satchel, reached inside without looking, and pulled out her compass. The needle spun. She put the compass away, pulled out her positioning stone, and watched it turn black in her palm, which meant one of two things. Either she was in an unregistered dimension, or she was in a dimension that had deliberately blocked mundane navigation tools. Neither option was good. The second option was considerably worse. She was a practical woman. She did not panic. She took a slow breath of the thick, hot air and turned in a careful circle, cataloguing what she could see. She was standing in a corridor massive in scale, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls carved with patterns she did not immediately recognize but which felt old in the way that made the back of her neck prickle, not decorative carvings, structural ones. These were words in a script she had seen fragments of in the restricted sections of the archive, a language that predated most of what scholars considered to be documented history. She was still reading them when she heard the footstep. It was a single step, and it was deliberate, not the sound of someone approaching accidentally or patrolling a route. It was the sound of someone who had noticed her and chosen, specifically, to announce their presence rather than simply appear. That single distinction was the thing that kept her from reaching for the defensive charm she had threaded through her coat's inner pocket. Something about the deliberateness of it felt almost courteous. She turned toward the sound. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, and he was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read from this distance, though she could see clearly enough that he was tall, that he wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little light existed in this place, and that his eyes held a faint luminescence that had nothing to do with reflection. He was not moving. He was simply standing there, watching her stand there, and the silence between them stretched out for a full 10 seconds before he spoke. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying across the distance without effort, without elevation. It was not a threatening voice. It was the voice of someone stating an obvious fact and waiting to see what she would do with it. "I'm aware of that," Seraphine said. She was pleased that her own voice came out steady. "My portal misfired. I'm trying to determine where here is." There was a pause. He tilted his head slightly, a small, almost bird-like movement that seemed at odds with the scale and weight of everything else about him. "Here," he said, "is the Dominion of Valdresh." She knew that name. Not well. It appeared in 3 texts she had read, all of them ancient, all of them treating the Dominion of Valdresh as something between a historical curiosity and a cautionary myth. It was one of the 7 sovereign underrealms, ruled for the past 8 centuries by a figure whose name appeared in those texts with a consistency that made her stomach drop slowly and quietly, the way a stone drops into deep water. "And you," she said carefully, because she was a researcher and researchers named things even when the naming was uncomfortable, are Cale Valdresh. He walked toward her then, not quickly, there was nothing urgent in his movement, but with the kind of unhurried certainty that comes from never having needed to hurry. He was closer now, and she could see his face more clearly, sharp-featured, dark-haired, with an expression that had settled somewhere between appraisal and something that might, in different circumstances, have been amusement. His eyes were not quite any color she had a word for. They shifted between dark gold and something deeper when the red light overhead moved. Demon Lord, he said, stopping about 6 feet from her, if you want the formal title. I don't particularly need the formal title, she said. I need the coordinates of my current location and ideally a portal anchor point I can use to recalibrate my exit. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the distinct impression that he was deciding something, though she couldn't tell what the options were. You walked through a protected dimensional seal, he said, the kind that doesn't open accidentally. My portal ring has been running the same coordinates for 4 years, she said. Something must have interfered with the calibration. Something, he repeated, and there was that edge of something again, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. You should know that the seal you came through is keyed to bloodlines. It does not respond to equipment malfunctions. Seraphine opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked back at the wall behind her, where the faint outline of a portal ring was just barely visible in the stone, not her ring, she realized now, but something much older, carved directly into the volcanic rock. And it was still glowing very faintly at its edges. Bloodlines! She turned back to face him. That's not possible, she said. I don't have any connections to Valdresh. That you know of, he said, and something in the way he said it was not mysterious or dramatic. It was simply matter of fact, the same way he had told her she wasn't supposed to be here, as though he were working with information she didn't have yet and was waiting with apparent patience for her to catch up. She picked up her satchel from the floor. She was going to need to think about this carefully, and she thought better when her hands were occupied. She pulled out her research journal, a reflex so automatic she barely noticed doing it, and the Demon Lord of Valdresh watched her uncap her pen and begin writing down what she had observed since arriving, and his expression shifted for the first time into something she could read clearly. He was surprised. Not alarmed, not offended, genuinely quietly surprised, the way a person looks when something entirely unexpected happens and they find, upon reflection, that they don't mind it. You're taking notes, he said. I always take notes, she said without looking up. It helps me think, what is the script on these walls? I've seen fragments of it before, but I don't have a complete lexicon. There was a silence. It's the founding language of the underrealm, he said slowly. It's been dead for 6 centuries. There are perhaps 4 people in all the known dimensions who can read it. Are you one of them? Yes. Then you can help me translate, she said and finally looked up, while we work out the bloodline situation if you're willing. Cale Valdresh, ruler of the Dominion of Valdresh for 800 years, lord of one of the 7 sovereign underrealms, looked at the human woman who had walked through his sealed dimensional portal by apparent accident, who was standing in the middle of his ancient corridor with a research journal and a pen, who had just proposed a working session as though they were colleagues at a conference rather than a demon lord and an accidental trespasser, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then very quietly he said, "All right." And that was how it began. She spent the first hour writing. He spent it watching her write, which she noticed but did not comment on, because she had spent enough time in research spaces to understand that people observed new things before they engaged with them, and there was nothing threatening about it. He answered her questions when she asked them what this phrase meant, what that symbol indicated, what the purpose of this particular chamber had been when it was built, and he answered them completely and without the kind of cagey hedging she was accustomed to from sources who thought information was leverage. He was, she thought, an exceptionally clear explainer. You've never had someone ask you these things before, she said, during a pause between questions. No, he said, most visitors to this realm are not here to conduct research. What are they usually here for? Conquest, he said, negotiation, occasionally revenge. And how do those usually go? Poorly, he said, for them. She wrote that down too because it was relevant context. He watched her write it and she thought she saw that flicker of something adjacent to amusement again, though it was subtle enough that she might have imagined it. You're not afraid of me, he said. It came out as an observation rather than a question, though there was a question underneath it. She considered how to answer honestly. I'm cautious, she said. I'm in an unknown location with limited exit options and my navigation tools aren't functioning. Cautious is appropriate, but you've been straightforward with me since I arrived and I don't think you're going to hurt me. What makes you think that? You announced yourself, she said. You could have simply appeared. The announcing was a choice, and the reason you make that choice generally is because you want the other person to stay calm. You wanted me calm, she paused, which suggests you want something from me, or you're curious about me, or possibly both. He was quiet for a moment. Possibly both, he said, and this time it was definitely something adjacent to amusement. That's fine, she said, and went back to her notes. By the end of the second hour, they had moved from the corridor into what appeared to be a study, enormous, stone-walled, lined with shelves that held artifacts and texts and things she could not immediately categorize. There was a table, actual chairs, and a light source that was warm and amber rather than red, which made the space feel considerably less ominous. She was starting to suspect that the red ambient light in the corridor was less a reflection of the realm's nature and more an architectural choice that had calcified into tradition centuries ago and no one had thought to revisit. She said as much, and he looked at her for a moment and then said very quietly, "That is a more perceptive observation than you know." She filed that away and kept working. It was deep into what she had started mentally calling the third hour when he said, without preamble, "The bloodline the seal recognized is not one I can explain easily." She set down her pen. "Try." "There is a lineage," he said, "that was removed from this realm's records 8 centuries ago, deliberately. It was done at the same time as certain other changes," he paused, "when I took the throne." "You removed a bloodline from the records when you took the throne," she said. "Why?" "To protect it," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, at the artifacts arranged there, at something that was not quite in the room with them. "From what?" she said. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "From me," he said, "from what I was then." The air in the study felt different after he said that, not heavier, if anything, slightly lighter, as though something had been set down. Seraphine picked up her pen. She wrote, "Bloodline removed from records, protected 8 centuries from himself." Then she looked up at the demon lord of Valdresh, who had ruled this realm for 800 years, and who had just said something to her that she suspected he had never said to anyone, and she said, "I think you should tell me the whole story." He looked at her then, those eyes that shifted between dark gold and something deeper. "It's a long story," he said. "I have time," she said, "and you have tea, I hope, because mine has been cold since before I got here." There was a pause, then slowly something shifted in his expression, something that started at the corners of his eyes and moved downward, and it was the first time she had seen anything approaching warmth in his face. It transformed him briefly and completely into something that was almost entirely unexpected. He stood up from his chair. "I have something better than tea," he said, "and I'll tell you the whole story." 800 years was a long time to carry something, and Cale Valdresh had become very good at carrying things quietly. He moved through his own study with a familiarity that was less comfort and more habit, the kind of familiarity that comes from spending so many years in a space that your body knows it without consulting your mind. He knew where every object was, every shelf, every shadow in the corner where the light from the amber source didn't quite reach. He had stopped seeing the room itself centuries ago. It had simply become an extension of what he was, part of the architecture of a life that had grown so long and so layered that certain portions of it had calcified into the background, indistinguishable from stone. He brought back 2 cups of something dark and warm that smelled like blackthorn and deep earth and winter, and set one in front of her without ceremony. She wrapped her hands around it and waited, and he found to his own quiet surprise that the waiting didn't bother him. She had a way of being still that was not passive, it was attentive, and there was a difference. Most people in his experience were still because they were afraid or because they were calculating. She was still because she was genuinely interested in what was going to come next, and she didn't want to interrupt it. He sat across from her and began. "When I came to the throne," he said, "Valdresh was not what it is now. It was a realm in collapse. The previous lord had ruled for 300 years and had spent the last 50 of them consolidating power through methods that destroyed the infrastructure he was trying to control. By the time he died, the upper corridors had been sealed for a generation, half the portal network was corrupted, and the founding families, the lineages that had built this realm before it was ever a dominion, had either fled or been scattered or buried in a way that made it difficult to determine which. "What happened to the lord who came before you?" she asked. He made an enemy of someone he should have kept close, he said. It's a common story in sovereign realms. He didn't elaborate and she didn't push. She wrote something in her journal. The founding families, she said, that's where the bloodline comes from. Yes, he turned the cup in his hands, watching the liquid inside move. There were 7 of them originally, 7 families that built Valdresh from raw dimensional substrate, a realm that didn't exist before they created it. The magic they used to do that was generational. It was woven into their blood over centuries, passed down through children and grandchildren until it became as fundamental to their descendants as breathing. And because it was tied to the creation of this place, it was also tied to the functioning of this place. The seals, she said, the portal locks. The portal locks, yes, and other things, the stabilization arrays under the lower level, the dimensional anchors that keep this realm from drifting, the founding language on the walls, those aren't just records, they're still active, they're part of the mechanism. He paused. The realm listens to founding blood. She was very still now, and one of those 7 families is connected to me somehow. The 7th, he said, the youngest of the founding lineages. They were the ones who built the portal network, the dimensional gates and the seals and the crossing points. They were the most traveled of the families, the least rooted in the physical realm itself, and because of that they were always the most vulnerable when things became unstable. They fled, she said. When the previous lord began his consolidation, yes, they scattered outwards through the portal network they had built, which they knew better than anyone. They went up into the higher dimensions, the human-adjacent planes, and from there further. He looked at her steadily. They went into the human world, and they didn't come back. She absorbed this. He watched her do it, watched her cataloging, filing, connecting pieces with that quiet efficiency that had surprised him from the moment she pulled out her journal. And the record of that lineage, she said, you removed it when you took the throne. I removed it before anyone could use it, he said. The previous lord had been trying to track the 7th family for decades before he died. He understood toward the end what founding blood could do to a realm, how much leverage it represented. If someone with that bloodline returned to Valdresh, even unknowingly, the realm would respond to them. The seals would open, the portal network would recognize them. He paused. They would have power here that they might not understand and couldn't necessarily control. And someone could use that, she said. Yes, so when I took the throne, one of the first things I did was remove the record, erase the lineage from the official histories, make the 7th family a footnote at best, and eventually not even that. She looked down at her journal, then back up at him, but you kept the record somewhere. The question landed with precision, and he was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, I kept it. Why? He turned the cup again in his hands. Because I thought eventually they might come back, and if they did, they deserved to know where they came from. She said nothing for a moment. The study was very quiet, filled only with the ambient warmth of the light source and the occasional deep structural sound that buildings make when they are old and settling. You've been here for 800 years, she said, and you protected a bloodline you had no reason to protect, people you'd never meet, descendants of a family you didn't know. You just held the record. It wasn't altruism, he said, and there was a precision in his voice as though he wanted to be accurate about this. In the beginning it was strategy. I needed to understand what the previous lord had been pursuing, and I needed to make sure no one else could use it the way he intended. Removing the public record and keeping a private one was the most controlled approach. And as the centuries passed, he was quiet. As the centuries passed, she said, it became something else. He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, the 7th family had a name, Voss. The room was very still. Seraphine Voss looked at the demon lord of Valdresh across the stone table in the ancient study, and for the first time since she had arrived, she was not writing in her journal. She was simply looking at him, and her expression had shifted from the careful, focused attention of a researcher into something more layered and human, something that mixed understanding with the particular vertigo of learning that the world is considerably larger than you believed it to be. Voss, she repeated. It was the family name they carried when they left, he said. I don't know if it survived in the human world intact. Names shift, families branch and merge and change them for dozens of reasons. My family has been Voss for as far back as the records go, she said, and our records go back further than most families I've encountered. My grandmother used to say our records went back to a door, and when she was young she thought that meant a doorway into a house. She paused. She probably meant a portal. Probably, he said. She reached for her cup, took a slow drink, and set it down. "This is a great deal of information," she said. "I need you to know I'm handling it, but I want to acknowledge that it's a great deal." "I know," he said, and there was something in his voice that was neither dismissal nor pity, but something closer to recognition. Like he was familiar with the experience of encountering a fact too large for immediate comprehension and having to find somewhere temporary to put it. "What does this mean for me?" she asked. "Practically, being the descendant of the seventh family." "It means the seals will open for you," he said. "It means the portal network, anywhere it still functions in Valdresh, will respond to you. It means the founding language, the one on the walls, you may find you can read portions of it without translation, if you haven't already." She was quiet, then slowly she turned back a few pages in her journal to something she had written in the first corridor, and she showed it to him. He looked at what she had transcribed from the wall carvings, and then at what she had written beside each phrase in small, careful notation. Translations, not complete, she had gaps marked with question marks, but the bones of it were accurate, the meaning caught even where the specific words weren't. "I thought I was recognizing patterns from texts I'd read," she said. "Fragments in the restricted archive sections. I assumed it was context inference." "You were reading it," he said. "The blood reads it. The archive fragments you mentioned, those would be the texts that made it into the upper dimensions when the seventh family left. They kept what they could carry." She closed the journal, opened it again, closed it. He watched this without comment. "I've spent my entire adult life studying dimensional structures and portal mechanics," she said. "I have a particular interest in pre-dimensional council languages and early realm architecture. I thought it was academic interest." She looked up. "It was heritage." "Yes," he said. "My portal ring," she said. "It's been calibrated to the same coordinates for 4 years, but it brought me here tonight." "Yes. Why tonight?" He considered the question carefully. "I've been wondering that myself," he said. "There's one possibility I can think of, but it requires me to show you something." He stood and she stood with him, and he moved toward the back of the study, toward a section of shelving she hadn't looked at closely yet. He stopped in front of a section that held no artifacts, just stone, carved with the founding language in dense, close lines. He pressed his palm against the center of the carving, and the stone shifted inward, revealing a narrow alcove. Inside was a single object, a small, flat disk of material she didn't recognize, covered in inscription on both sides, sealed at its edges with something that looked like hardened light. "This is the record," he said, "the private one, the history of the seventh family, the Voss lineage, from the founding of the realm to the day they left. Everything I could compile from the existing documents before I removed the public version." He paused. "It's been sealed since I completed it, roughly 780 years ago." She looked at the disk, then at him. "It started glowing again 3 days ago," he said, "for the first time since I sealed it." The silence in the study was absolute. "The seals respond to founding blood," she said slowly. "Yes. So when this started glowing 3 days ago, it meant a descendant of the seventh family had come close enough to a functioning dimensional crossing that the resonance registered," he said. "I didn't know who, I didn't know from which direction, I only knew that someone was there." He looked at the disk, then at her. "And then tonight you walked through my portal." Seraphine stood in the ancient study of the demon lord of Valdresh, looking at a record that was nearly 800 years old and had started glowing because of her blood, and she thought about her grandmother who had talked about a door. She thought about her mother, who had an uncanny sense of direction in unfamiliar spaces. She thought about herself and her inexplicable ease with portal mechanics, and the way she had always felt that dimensional architecture was not something she was learning, but something she was remembering. She thought about the archive of mists where she had been headed tonight, which held, in its restricted section, fragments of the founding language that she had always been able to read just a little better than she should. "Can I hold it?" she asked. "The record?" "You can do more than hold it," he said. "The seal will open for you. I haven't been able to open it since I closed it. I don't have founding blood." She reached out carefully and lifted the disc from the alcove. It was lighter than it looked. At the contact of her fingers against its edge, the sealed edges began to shift, the hardened light softening and drawing back like ice in warm water, unhurried and complete. "It opened." Inside were pages, not paper, not parchment, but something else, thin and durable and covered in dense inscription that she could read, every word, as easily and naturally as reading her own language. She stood in the study of the demon lord and began to read her own history. He stood beside her, not too close, not too distant, and said nothing. He had held this record for nearly 8 centuries, waiting for someone who could open it, and now that they were here, he found he had very little to say. The moment didn't need words from him. It only needed him to stay, which was something he had become, across 800 years, extraordinarily good at. She read for a long time. He refilled their cups once. Outside the study, or what served as outside, in a realm without conventional sky, something deep in the structure of Valdresh made a sound it hadn't made in centuries. A low, resonant hum, like a bell struck too softly to ring, like something returning to itself. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright and not with distress. "My grandmother's house," she said, "the stone in the basement that she always called the foundation stone. I used to put my hand on it when I was little because it was always warm." She paused. She said it was because the house had good bones. "A founding anchor," he said. "The seventh family carried anchor stones when they left, personal pieces of the realm substrate." She had no idea what it was, she said. "No," he said, "that was deliberate. The generation that left, they chose to leave the knowledge behind, to give their descendants a clean life untouched by all of this." He gestured, a small motion that encompassed the study, the realm, the centuries. "They loved their children enough to cut them loose. And in doing so," she said, "they left them with abilities and instincts they couldn't explain." "Yes," he said, "I imagine that was difficult." "It was confusing," she said. "I spent a significant portion of my academic career trying to understand why portal mechanics felt intuitive to me when they're not intuitive to most people." She looked down at the record in her hands. "This is a strange thing to find out." "Strange," he agreed, "but not bad." She looked at him. "No," she said after a moment, "not bad." She set the record carefully on the table and picked up her cup. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You've been asking me personal questions since you arrived," he said. "I haven't objected yet." "Fair point." She looked at the record. "You protected this for 8 centuries. You protected a lineage you'd never met, removed the record to keep them safe, held the private version for when they returned. And you said at first it was strategy." She paused. "What was it later?" He was very still. "I don't know that I have a clean word for it," he said finally. "The First Lord had tried to use them, had spent decades hunting descendants of a founding family who had done nothing wrong and wanted only to live their lives. When I removed the public record, I think part of it was simply, I didn't want to be the second person to do what he had done." "Decency," she said. "Perhaps," he turned his cup, "or perhaps something more specific. The seventh family left because this realm became dangerous, and they left because they loved their children, and I thought after a while that there was something worth honoring in that, in the choice they made, even if no one else knew about it." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. The amber light in the study made everything warmer, and the study itself was very quiet, and the demon lord of Valdresh looked, in this moment, less like the subject of ancient cautionary texts, and more like someone who had been alone for a very long time and had made the best of it. "I want to come back," she said, "after I've recalibrated my portal and gone home and slept, because I haven't slept and I'm running on research adrenaline and this cup of whatever this is." She indicated the cup. "I want to come back and keep working through this, the language, the history, all of it, if that's something you would permit." He was quiet. "You wouldn't need my permission," he said. "The seals will open for you, they're keyed to your bloodline." "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway because it's your home, and the polite thing to do when you want to visit someone's home is to ask." The thing that had been something adjacent to amusement earlier had deepened into something else entirely. He was looking at her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she doubted was common for him, and there was, beneath everything else, something that looked very much like gratitude, though it was the kind that has been kept quiet for so long it has nearly forgotten how to show itself. "Yes," he said, "come back." She came back on Thursday. She had spent the previous day sleeping, eating food with nutritional value, and sitting with the anchor stone in her grandmother's basement, which she now understood was a piece of original Valdresh substrate, and also explained why the basement had always had better cell reception than the rest of the house, which had been a minor mystery for years. She had also written 14 pages of notes, reorganized her research journal, eaten more food, and sat quietly on her grandmother's old kitchen chair thinking about the nature of a life that turns out to have roots you never knew about, which is a different experience than simply discovering information. It was not distressing, she had decided. It was large. Large things took space to accommodate properly, and the appropriate response was to give them space rather than force them smaller. On Thursday evening, she recalibrated her portal ring, not to the archive of mists this time, but to the coordinates she had read in the founding record, the precise dimensional signature of the Valdresh corridor. She had expected the calibration to be difficult. It was not. It was, as the demon lord had suggested it would be, intuitive in the way that breathing was intuitive, in the way that her hands knew how to hold a pen. She stepped through and the hot, sulfur-heavy air met her again, and the red, ambient light of the corridor was there, and this time she felt beneath the strangeness of it something else, a resonance in the walls, a hum that she now understood was the realm itself registering her presence and adjusting accordingly, the same way a house settles differently when someone comes home. He was not in the corridor this time, but she found when she followed the passage to his study that the door was open and there were 2 cups already on the table. This told her a number of things about the realm's response to founding blood, but it also told her something about him that she chose to file quietly in a separate section of her journal, under no particular heading. He appeared in the doorway of an adjacent room a few minutes later, moving with the same unhurried certainty as before. "The anchor recognized you 3 minutes before you arrived," he said. "I heard it shift." "And you made the cups before you knew what direction I'd come from," she observed. "The study is the logical place to begin," he said. "You left your notes here." She had in fact left her notes here deliberately because it was a reasonable excuse and she was a practical person. She settled into the chair she had used before, the one that faced the shelves, so she could see the alcove where the record had been kept, and he sat across from her, and there was, between them, the comfortable ease of a second meeting that has been anticipated by both parties and is therefore already half familiar. "I want to tell you something," she said after they had sat for a moment, "about what happened when I went home." "All right," he said. "I sat with the anchor stone in my grandmother's basement for a long time," she said. "While I was sitting there I could feel, I don't know quite how to describe it, like a signal, very faint from a distance." He was very still. "From this direction," she said, "or what I now understand to be this direction." "The realm," he said, "it's been active since you arrived and left. The anchors are resonating." "All of them?" "The ones that still function, yes. There are 11 remaining anchor points in the lower levels. They've been dormant for 6 centuries." He paused. "They're not dormant anymore." She absorbed this. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "In the long term, the opposite. The anchor points are part of the stabilization structure. When the 7th family left, they took their anchor stones and the corresponding points in the realm went passive. The realm has been running on reduced infrastructure ever since." He paused. "I've been maintaining it, but there are limits to what maintenance can do when the underlying structure is compromised." "Your realm has been running on reduced infrastructure for 6 centuries," she said, "and you didn't try to find the 7th family and bring them back." "No. Why?" "Because they chose to leave," he said, "and their descendants didn't choose anything. They were born into a life they had no context for. Pulling someone back into an obligation they never agreed to seemed." "Wrong," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "You're a more careful person than the cautionary texts suggest." "The cautionary texts are about a specific period," he said, and something in his voice was careful in a different way, the carefulness of someone choosing words around a truth that is not yet ready to be said simply. "When I first took the throne, the methods I used then were," he paused, "effective, and not things I would use now." 800 years is a long time to change," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She turned her cup. "I'm not going to ask you to account for all of it today. I want you to know that. I'm curious about everything, including the parts that are complicated, but I'm not conducting a trial." He looked at her steadily. "Why not? You should be. You've walked into a sovereign underrealm run by someone with a considerable historical record." "Because you've been straightforward with me since I arrived," she said, "and because the record you kept of my family's lineage for 780 years was kind, and because you made tea before you knew which direction I was coming from." She paused. Also because I'm a researcher and researchers are methodologically opposed to conclusions drawn before evidence is collected. I have a great deal of evidence left to collect. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you are a very specific type of person. Apparently it runs in the family, she said. The founding record describes the seventh family as the ones who asked questions. They were, he said, the other families built. The seventh family wanted to understand why things built the way they did. He paused. It made them extraordinary architects and insufferable dinner guests. She laughed genuinely, warmly, and he went still in a particular way that she had noticed once before, the night she had arrived, when he had watched her pull out her journal. The stillness of someone encountering something unexpected and finding it, upon reflection, welcome. Tell me about the other families, she said. The founding six, what happened to them? He talked and she wrote, and the hours passed without either of them marking them particularly. He was, she found, a different kind of talker than most of her sources. He didn't perform knowledge the way academics often did, that particular habit of wearing what you know as a display of self. He simply conveyed it clearly and specifically, and when he didn't know something he said so without embarrassment. When she caught a discrepancy between something he said and something she had read in the founding record, he was interested rather than defensive. You're right, he said the second time this happened. I misremembered the timeline. The third family left after the second, not before. It's an easy error, she said. The record is dense. I have a perfect recall of most things, he said. It's a function of living long enough that memory becomes structural like the walls, but emotional weight distorts it sometimes. The period of the founding families was a difficult time when I was learning this realm. I may have compressed parts of it in ways that don't match the documentary record. She wrote emotional weight distorts even perfect recall, then she added significant. Can I ask about the period the texts refer to? She said, the early centuries, the cautionary period. He was quiet, not resistant, thoughtful. Yes, he said, what do you want to know? What were you doing that was so terrible? She said directly. The texts frame it as conquest and dominion and domination, which are evocative words but not particularly specific. What were you actually doing? He looked at the table for a moment. Establishing control, he said, through methods that were effective in the immediate term and corrosive in the long term. The previous lord had left a power vacuum. Into a power vacuum things flood. I was young, by the standards of what I am, I was very young, and I understood force better than I understood structure, so I used force. Against other realms. Some against factions within Valdresh more often, anyone who might contest the stability I was building. He paused. The texts are not wrong about what happened, they're wrong about the reasoning, or rather they attribute reasoning that was simpler and crueler than what was actually there. I was not dominating for pleasure, I was trying to stop the collapse. But the methods were still. Yes, he said, they were. She wrote for a moment. When did that change? Gradually, he said, over centuries, when the realm was stable enough that force was no longer the only tool that worked, I had to learn other tools. Some of that learning was, he paused, humbling. What does humbling look like for a demon lord? He looked at her steadily. Losing, he said, in ways that force can't address, losing a negotiation because I didn't understand subtlety, losing an alliance because I didn't understand that trust had to be built slowly and couldn't be demanded. He paused, losing things that mattered and only understanding afterward what they had been. She put down her pen. I'm sorry, she said, not the performance of sympathy but the simple, genuine expression of it. He looked at her and his expression was complicated. You say that as though it's simple. It is simple, she said. You've had a very long life that included a lot of loss. That's a simple thing to be sorry about. The details are complicated, the core of it isn't. He was very quiet. What did you lose, she asked, if you're willing to say. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. People, he said, relationships I handled badly because I didn't know how to handle them well, chances to build things that would have been different, better, probably. He looked at the shelves. The realm is whole and stable and has been for 600 years. I built what I set out to build, but the building took everything, and when it was done I was alone in what I had built, and that was not something I had calculated. Did it surprise you, she said. More than almost anything else in 8 centuries, he said, which is its own kind of humbling. She picked up her pen again, not to write, just to hold it, the way she held it when she was thinking. I've been conducting research alone for 11 years, she said. My particular intersection of dimensional mechanics and precouncil linguistics is narrow enough that there aren't many people who understand it well enough to be useful interlocutors. I have colleagues, I have professional relationships, but the actual work, she paused. I've been doing the actual work alone. He looked at her. I'm not equating it to 8 centuries, she said. I'm noting that I understand the architecture of a life built around work, where the work is full and the rest of it is sparse. Yes, he said quietly, that's it exactly. They sat with that for a moment. The study was warm and quiet, and outside it the realm hummed at a frequency that had changed since she arrived, fuller now, the way an instrument sounds different when more strings are in tune. The anchor points, she said, the 11 that are resonating, what would it take to fully reactivate them? Your presence, he said, physical presence in each chamber, and for each one a reading of the founding inscription, the passage specific to that chamber. They'll respond to the blood and the language together. Can we start tomorrow, she said. He blinked, a small motion but visible. You want to? I want to help stabilize your realm, she said. I have the bloodline, I have the language, and you've been running on compromised infrastructure for 600 years because a group of people I'm descended from had to leave to keep their children safe. She paused. That doesn't feel like something I should leave unaddressed. You don't owe this, he said. No, she agreed. I don't owe it, I want to do it. There's a difference and the difference matters. He was very still. Why, he said. Because the realm is remarkable, she said, because the history of it deserves to function the way it was designed to, and because, she paused, because you kept the record, 780 years, Cale, you kept it for people you never met because it was the right thing to hold on to. The least I can do is come back on a Thursday. He said nothing for a long moment. Friday would also work, he said finally. I'll block both days, she said, and went back to her notes, and he watched her write, and the amber light in the study made everything warm and the realm kept humming. They worked through 7 of the 11 anchor chambers over the following 2 weeks. She came 3 times, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes arriving in the late evening and leaving near what would have been midnight by her home dimensions reckoning. He was always there when she arrived, always with the cups already made, always with whatever section of the founding record relevant to the next chamber already located and placed on the table. She noticed that he had begun to anticipate things, small things, the fact that she preferred the chair facing the shelves, the fact that she worked better when the room was quiet for the first hour and more conversational in the second. The fact that when she encountered something in the records that troubled her, a passage about a founding family member who had died badly, or a section that described the realm's early years in terms that were harsher than expected, she went quiet in a specific way that was different from her normal working quiet, and that the best response to that quiet was simply to wait and not to ask. He noticed these things and adjusted for them without commentary, and she noticed that he was noticing and did not comment on that either. There was a comfortable privacy to this noticing, an agreement implicit and mutual that they were both paying attention and both choosing not to make a performance of it. In the 7th anchor chamber, which was smaller than the others and tucked into the deep interior of the realm, the inscription on the walls was the longest and most complex she had encountered. She spent nearly an hour reading it before she reached the passage for the activation, and when she read it aloud with the old words feeling natural in her mouth the way they always did now, the anchor lit from within. It was beautiful, not dramatic, not a burst of light or a sound, but a slow, warm illumination, like a coal catching, like something that had been cold for a very long time remembering what heat was. The walls of the chamber responded to it, the founding script glowing faintly at its edges, and the floor hummed at a frequency she felt in her feet. She turned from the anchor to find him watching her face, not the anchor. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You look. What? She said again. You look the way the record describes the 7th family, he said, when they built things, that expression. She put a hand on the activated anchor, feeling the warmth of it. What does the record say about that expression? He was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice was careful in the way it was when he was choosing words precisely. Like they were home, he said. She looked at the glowing anchor and the humming walls and the ancient chamber. She thought about her grandmother's basement and the stone that was always warm. She thought about 11 years of research conducted in productive but somewhat sparse isolation. She thought about the precise temperature of this room and the way the founding language sat in her mind, not like learned vocabulary but like something recovered. "I've been trying to find the right word for what this feels like," she said, "coming here." "And," he said, "I keep landing on familiar," she said, "which doesn't quite make sense because I've never been here before." "Blood memory," he said, "the realm is in your lineage even if you weren't raised with the knowledge of it. When you're here, some part of you recognizes the substrate." "Is that what it is?" she said. He was very close now. They had been working side by side in the small chamber all hour, and the space had simply arranged them that way. "I don't know what else to call it," he said, and there was something in his voice that was careful and unguarded at the same time, a combination that she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him specifically, that he was someone who had learned to be very careful with things that mattered to him, but that the care itself was evidence of the mattering. "I want to tell you something," she said, "that I've been thinking about since the first night." "All right," he said. "When you walked toward me in the corridor," she said, "and I asked if you were Cale Valdresh and you said Demon Lord if you want the formal title, I thought immediately, this is someone who is used to being feared and is not particularly invested in whether I fear him or not. And that was interesting to me, because most people who are used to being feared are quite invested in continuing to be feared." "And what did you make of it?" he said. "I made of it," she said, "that you were tired of it, the fear, that it had been useful a long time ago and you had maintained it because it was practical but that the maintenance had become routine, that you had stopped particularly wanting it." He was very still. "Was I right?" she said. A long moment passed. "Yes," he said. "Then I want to say," she said, "that I am not afraid of you, and I don't think you're particularly fearsome as a person. What you are as a person is someone who held a record for 780 years because it was the right thing to hold, and who has been running a compromised realm alone for 600 years because he respected the choice of people who needed to leave, and who makes the cups before he knows which direction someone is coming from." She paused. "That's what I think you are as a person." He looked at her for a long moment. The chamber hummed around them, the anchor warm and steady at her back. "Seraphine," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and the way he said it was the same way the realm had hummed when she first arrived, like something returning to a frequency that had been absent for a very long time. "Yes," she said. "I would very much like you to keep coming back," he said. She looked at him, the remaining anchor chambers. "After those," he said, "I would like you to keep coming back after those." She was quiet for a moment, the anchor glowed warm and steady, the realm hummed. "I'll need my own portal coordinates," she said, "something more precise than the emergency seal calibration, something I can use reliably from my study." "I'll make you one," he said, "a permanent anchor point keyed to your bloodline. It would take about a day to carve and calibrate." "Then start tomorrow," she said, "I'll come Friday." She picked up her research journal from where she had set it on the floor of the chamber, and she began making her notes, and he stood beside her in the warm light of the reactivated anchor, and for the first time in 6 centuries, the realm was not quiet. She came on Fridays and sometimes Tuesdays, and occasionally on days that were neither, when she was deep in a research thread that required the founding records and couldn't wait until her next scheduled visit. She always told him she was coming. She messaged through the anchor point he had carved her, a communication function she had discovered on her own and which he found he was not surprised she had found, because she had a way of understanding things thoroughly once she began to understand them at all. The anchor point messages were brief and functional: "Coming tonight if the timing works for you, have questions about the third family's stabilization methods, or can't make Friday, will come Sunday instead, sorry for the change." The apology the first time she included it had given him pause. He was not accustomed to people apologizing for inconveniences they caused him. He was not even accustomed to people thinking they might cause inconveniences. He found that he thought about the apology for several hours after receiving it, which was not the sort of thing he normally thought about. The remaining anchor chambers were completed over a month. Each activation was its own specific event. Some of the chambers were cold from disuse, some had been partially damaged over the centuries and required her to improvise around gaps in the inscriptions, and in one case the chamber wall had partially collapsed and they spent 3 hours clearing rubble before she could reach the activation inscription at all. He had offered during the rubble clearing to handle the physical work himself. She had declined on the grounds that 2 people moving stones was faster than 1, which was true, and also seemed to give her genuine satisfaction, which he noticed. When the 11th anchor activated, the realm made a sound that was audible. Not to human ears exactly, but she felt it, a resonance through the floors, through the walls, through the air, a long deep tone like the lowest note of an instrument so large it had no name. She stood in the chamber with her hand on the anchor, feeling the vibration travel through her palm, up her arm, through her chest. "That's the full infrastructure," he said from beside her. "Is this what it sounded like when it was first built?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "I wasn't here for the founding." He paused, "But I've read descriptions, and yes, I think this is what it sounded like." She stood with her hand on the anchor for a long time. He didn't rush her. The research continued after the anchors were done, because she was who she was and there was too much in the Valdresh records for a person with her particular combination of skills and interests to simply leave. She was building something, a comparative study of founding language structures across the 7 sovereign underrealms, using the Valdresh records as the primary source, cross-referenced against the archive fragments she had spent years analyzing. She worked on it in her own study at home and in his study in Valdresh in roughly equal measure, and the work had a quality that her solo research never had. It was better. Not because she was less capable alone, she was capable alone, she had proven that for 11 years, but because there was someone to talk to in the middle of it. Someone who could look at a passage she was wrestling with and say, without preamble, what he thought it meant, and who was right often enough and wrong interestingly enough that either answer advanced her work. Cale was, she had concluded this carefully over several months, with the methodological rigor she applied to conclusions, an extraordinary intellectual companion. He had 8 centuries of contextual knowledge that no archive could provide. He had a mind that worked in long arcs, connecting things across centuries that most people couldn't hold in their heads simultaneously. And he had the particular quality that she found most valuable in a collaborator. He did not agree with her when he thought she was wrong, and he explained why clearly and specifically, and he was not invested in being right, only in the question being answered correctly. She realized around month 4, stopped thinking of the visits as research visits. She had started thinking of them as going to Valdresh, the way you think of going somewhere familiar and welcome, the way you think of going somewhere that holds something important. He had, around the same period, stopped watching her arrive from a careful distance and started coming to meet her at the portal point when she arrived, which was a small change and which neither of them had remarked on. There was an evening in the 5th month that she would think about afterward as the evening things shifted, though in truth things had been shifting incrementally for a long time, and this was simply the evening that the shift became visible. She had arrived agitated, she arrived with many emotional states, and he had learned to read them, but agitated was one he had not seen before. She put her satchel down harder than usual. She opened her journal and stared at it without writing. "What happened?" he said. "The Archive Council," she said. "They've denied my application for extended access to the restricted collection, the founding language section." He sat down across from her. "Why?" "Officially, because my research methodology doesn't meet their current access criteria. Actually," she said, "because 2 of the council members believe that pre-council linguistics is a fringe field and I'm wasting archive resources." "Your research is not fringe," he said. "It's among the most significant work being done in dimensional scholarship." "I know that," she said. "The Archive Council disagrees." He was quiet for a moment. "The texts they're restricting, what are they?" "Founding language fragments from 3 of the other sovereign underrealms. I need them to complete the comparative section of my study. Without them," she stopped. "I can infer, I've been inferring, but the comparative analysis needs primary sources." "I have the equivalent texts for Valdresh," he said. "What about the other realms?" "I don't have contacts in the other 6 sovereign underrealms," she said. "I don't have a way to request access through proper channels. They're not exactly open to academic requests." He was very quiet. Two of the other realms, he said, are in standing communication with Valdresh. We have diplomatic relationships that have been maintained for centuries. He paused. I can make an inquiry as a formal request between realm lords. She looked at him. That's... Your research would benefit the historical record of all the founding realms, he said. That's a legitimate ground for a diplomatic inquiry. I know, but you'd be using your diplomatic standing for something worth using it for, he said. Seraphine, when did I last use diplomatic standing for anything? She considered. I don't actually know. A long time, he said. It exists. It should do something with itself. She looked at him for a moment, and the agitation in her expression settled into something else, something warm and layered that she looked away from quickly, the way people look away from something they're not quite ready to look at directly. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me until it works, he said. I'm thanking you for the offer, she said. The result is separate. He looked at her. You do that, he said. Separate the gesture from the outcome. It's the honest way to do it, she said. The gesture has value independent of whether it succeeds. He was quiet for a moment. I know that intellectually, he said. I find it, he paused. I find it harder to practice than to understand. Most things are, she said, and then because she was who she was, why? He turned his cup. When you live long enough, he said, you start weighting things by outcome rather than intention, because intention is interior and outcome is what persists, what lasted, what was built, what changed, those are what remain after a century. The gesture without a result is, he paused. It's hard to value when you've seen enough results. That's a lonely way to live, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she picked up her pen. I'm going to tell you something that I believe is true, she said, and I'm asking you to hold it even if it doesn't feel true yet. All right, he said. The fact that you held the seventh family's record for 780 years, she said, was a gesture without a known outcome. You didn't know if anyone would come, you didn't know if the record would ever be opened, you kept it because it was right with no guarantee of result. She paused. So you do know how to value the gesture separate from the outcome. You've been doing it for centuries, you just don't count it when you look at yourself. He said nothing. She went back to her notes. He sat across from her in a silence that was different from his usual silence, fuller, somehow, as though something had been introduced into it. After a while he said, the diplomatic inquiry, I'll send it tomorrow. Then I'll start drafting the research questions tonight, she said, so we have them ready when the response comes. We, he repeated very quietly. She looked up. It's your diplomatic standing and my research question, she said. That's a collaboration. You don't have to be in the same room for it to be a we. He looked at her, and his expression was doing the thing it sometimes did, the thing that began at the corners of his eyes and moved downward, the warmth that had apparently been waiting for the right conditions to emerge, and which, over the past 5 months, had been emerging with increasing frequency. No, he said quietly, I suppose you don't. The diplomatic inquiry produced responses from 2 realms within a fortnight, and she had her primary sources before the end of the month. The research accelerated. The comparative study took shape, not just as an academic document, which it was, but as something more complete, the first comprehensive map of the founding language across multiple sovereign underrealms, demonstrating that what scholars had treated as distinct linguistic systems were in fact variations on a single original structure, ancient enough to predate the dimensional council by millennia. It was the kind of work that would change fields, and both of them knew it, and the knowledge sat between them in the study during working sessions as a warm and mutual awareness that needed no particular expression. It was during one of these sessions, late in the 6th month, that she said without looking up from her work, I told my colleague about Valdresh today. He paused. What did you tell them? That I'd found a primary source, she said, and that I'd been coming here regularly. She looked up. I didn't tell them everything. I told them I'd connected with a realm contact who was helping with the research. How did that land? He said. They asked if the contact was trustworthy, she said, and I said yes, and they asked how I knew, and I said, she paused. I said because he's been straightforward with me since the moment I arrived, and because I've had enough time to see who he is rather than what he was. He was very still. You defended me, he said. I stated accurate information, she said. That's not quite the same thing. It's close enough, he said. She put down her pen. "Kale," she said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I've been thinking about what this is," she said with the directness that was, he had come to understand simply how she worked, not bluntness for its own sake, but honesty applied carefully. "What we're doing here, the visits, the research," she paused, "everything." He said nothing. He was very still in the particular way of someone who is listening to something important and not wanting to interrupt it. "I'm not in the habit of forming attachments quickly," she said. "I'm a careful person by nature, and I've spent enough time in academic environments to be cautious about professional crossover of any kind." She looked at the table, then at him. "But I've been aware for some time that what I feel about coming here is not primarily professional interest." He was quiet for a moment. "What is it primarily?" he said, and his voice was careful in the way it was when things mattered. "It's that I like being here," she said. "I like the work we do here. I like this." She indicated the space between them, the table, the two cups. "I like talking to you. I like that you're honest about complicated things. I like that you remember what I said 2 months ago and connect it to what I'm saying now. I like that you made the cups before you knew which direction I was coming from." She paused. "I have liked you for longer than I've said so, because I wanted to be sure I was liking the actual person and not the novelty of the situation." "And you're sure now?" he said. "I'm sure now," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. 800 years of careful living were very visible in his face in this moment, she thought, not as damage but as depth, as the accumulated weight of someone who had learned the hard way what things were worth being careful about and what things were worth, despite the care, reaching for. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "The night you arrived," he said, "when I saw you standing in the corridor with your satchel and your journal and your cold thermos of tea, I was surprised, and I've told you I was surprised, but what I haven't said is that underneath the surprise there was something else, something immediate and instinctive that I didn't know how to name, and so I left it unnamed." She waited. "I've named it now," he said. "It took a few months." "What is it?" she said. "Recognition," he said, "not of you specifically, I'd never met you, but the particular kind of recognition that comes from encountering someone who is, in some fundamental way, the same shape as you are, who thinks in the same direction, who," he paused. "I have been in this realm for 800 years, and in all of that time I have not met someone who made me feel less alone simply by being in the room." "Until me," she said. "Until you walked through the wrong portal," he said, "which turns out to have been the right one." She looked at him for a long moment. The amber light was warm. The realm hummed at full frequency around them, all 11 anchors active, the infrastructure whole. In her grandmother's basement, she knew the anchor stone was glowing. It had been glowing steadily for months now. "I want to be clear about something," she said, "because I believe in being clear." "Of course you do," he said, and there was that warmth again. "This is not a simple situation," she said. "I live in a different dimension. You are," she gestured at him, at the room, at the general concept of him. "You are what you are. There are 8 centuries of history between us that aren't mine and a great deal that would need to be navigated carefully." "Yes," he said. "I'm not suggesting that any of that makes it impossible," she said. "I'm suggesting it makes it something that needs to be approached the same way any serious thing is approached." "Carefully," he said. "With thought," she said, "with time, with honesty about what works and what doesn't." "You're proposing a methodology," he said, and his voice was the warmest she had ever heard it. "I'm proposing that we be deliberate about it," she said, "which we both are about things that matter, and this," she looked at him, "this matters to me." "To me also," he said, "more than I have adequate language for, even in 8 languages. 9 if you count the founding one," she said. 10, he said, "I forgot Verak." "Then we'll work on the vocabulary," she said, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was a small gesture and a large one, and he turned his hand over under hers and held it, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm amber light, while the realm hummed around them at full frequency for the first time in 600 years. Later, she would tell her colleague that she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for, which was a somewhat vague summary that satisfied no one, but was the most honest condensed version she could manage. Later he would add a new entry to the private records he had kept since he took the throne, not the Voss lineage record which was now open and no longer needed his custody, but his own record, the personal one which was sparse and factual in most places, and which had a new entry dated to the evening a woman had walked through his sealed portal by apparent accident and proposed a working session. The entry read, "The seventh family came back, or a descendant of them did. Her name is Seraphine, she takes notes, she is not afraid of me, she says this is not primarily professional interest and I believe her because I am not afraid of her either, which is the relevant symmetry. I have been careful for 800 years, I intend to be careful with this too, but differently, the kind of careful that is attentive rather than guarded, the kind that makes the cups before the direction is known and then waits. She will come on Friday, possibly Tuesday also. This is, I find, the best thing I have thought in a very long time. She came on Friday. She came on Tuesday. She came on days that were neither, when the work or the wanting pulled her back. He was always there. The portal ring in her study had developed a faint luminescence at its edges that was not a malfunction and not a calibration error. It was the realm, her colleague would have said, the realm recognizing her, resonating, keeping the connection warm between visits. She knew that was true. She also thought it might be something else, that the luminescence was less the realm and more something the realm and its lord had in common, a particular quality of attention, warm and steady and patient, that didn't diminish when she left and didn't need her presence to persist, but was genuinely, thoroughly brighter when she came back. She had walked through the wrong portal and arrived somewhere that turned out to be right in all the ways that mattered. She had met her destiny, though that was not a word she would typically use. It had too much inevitability in it, too much removal of agency. She preferred to say, she had walked through the wrong portal and found someone who had been holding a record for her lineage for 780 years, and they had sat across a stone table and talked until the amber light seemed warmer than it was, and she had come back on Friday, and she would come back again. That was not destiny, that was a choice made carefully and made again, which was the only way choices like that held. She preferred that version. She suspected he did too.